Howdy! My name is Matt Hickerson. I am in Miss Facilities class, and the title of my project is The People You Meet, Mark Twain's Views on a Race or Two and the People Who Influence These Views. Alright, so Samuel Clemens and race relations. I'm just going to say some stuff that most people know about him, and that... Can I put this on pause, please? Pause. Can I do that at all?
What are you trying to do?
Pause it, instead of it just going through, you know? Okay, awesome. So I'm going to say some stuff that most people do know about Clemens and what most people don't know. First off, we all know that he was raised in an era where prejudice, white supremacy, all that jazz, it was very commonplace, and it was mostly accepted as the way things are. It was right. We also know that at some point in his life, he rejected this prejudice when concerning the African American, and because of this, he ended up writing a multitude of readings and a classic or two expressing these views and showing really exposing the kind of race relations that whites and blacks had with each other. But some things that most people don't know, however, is that when it came to the natives, he really didn't pull many punches when it came to a good amount of his literature. And as well, most people don't know the people who might have influenced these views on both races. So, first off, my project is mainly about the comparison between African Americans and Native Americans in his writing, and as well the people who influenced it. But why are the people important, somebody might ask? Well, you see, it's Mark Twain. He is basically the symbol of Americana. I mean, take Huck Finn, for example. It is a story about a boy who is trying to help an escaped slave to get to freedom by going down the Mississippi River. And the thing about it is, this boy is having a struggle inside himself about what he's actually... Sorry about that. I'll just do that. But he's having a struggle within himself about just the validity of what he's doing, because society says that what he is doing is wrong. Basically, say his peers, his superiors, and God himself, well, God at the time, of course, they all view slavery and this kind of prejudice as just, like I said, it's right. It's the way things should be. So instead of just conforming with it, he takes the conglomerative view and says that it is wrong. He creates an opinion of his own, and basically he just decides that he decides to help this man. But why? Because Jim is his friend. He has made enough of an impact on this boy to precipitate a change. And why? But when you keep that fresh in your mind, because that's something that is it's something that's that much of an impact, it's crazy. Because he's basically denying this view, even if it means that he's going to spend an eternity in hellfire. But keeping this in your mind, why wouldn't it be important to talk about the people who made the impact on the man who wrote about the impact on a boy that impacted the nation even today? So, brings me to my question. Why did Clemens see the injustices done to African Americans enough so to find sympathy as well as come to like them, yet inversely find half an iota of a positive outlook when it comes to Native Americans? And that brings me to his early life and upbringing. He describes Hannibal as basically a place of mild slavery, as opposed to most people's, as opposed to the depiction of the violent and large plantation where the sadistic slave master is beating the helpless slave. But he still says that black servitude was very apparent, and it was seen as right, as I once said. So even though it was a mild slavery, or where you didn't see much of the sadism that occurred, or that we think about, it was still slavery. So he was still growing up with, much like many other children, that were growing up at the time, seeing it as just a way of life. But fortunately, there were a few instances that helped him to really realize just the absurdity of it. And I'm going to mention 2 negative ones and 2 positives. The first 2 would be the fact that he recollects in his autobiography that when the slave master would mosey on into town, see, he would be able to see this kind of foreign picture to him that wasn't really in his town very much of his basic product. All these slaves just chained up together side by side and everything, and he described them as the saddest faces he had ever seen. As well, he also talks about one point in the town where a man shot and killed a slave for simply acting awkward, and that the only sympathy that was shown towards anybody was towards the slave's owner, who could not, get a reimbursement for his property. But as well, there were some positive experiences too, such as the ones on his uncle's farm where he would spend months at a time at each year. And those 2 experiences would be the Negro kids that him and his siblings would play with day by day. So he got to see a little bit of equality in them both, even though both sides knew they weren't really equal. And as well, a middle-aged slave named Daniel, who would tell all of them stories of Uncle Remus by the herd. And he said that he actually used Daniel in a few of his writings, once by the name of Jim. If anybody might catch that. But there were also family ties and influences as far as his basic liking towards African Americans. His mom, even though she did not think that the institution was wrong, she was always very kind towards the slaves that they owned, and she tried to teach Clemens to be kind too. But concerning the Native American, she kind of despised them due to the fact that there was a massacre, according to a scholar, Carrie Drisdale, that a band of Indians ended up massacring her ancestors in Kentucky. But another influence was also Orion, his brother, 10 years older than him. He was already an abolitionist by the time that Clemens had hit his prepubescence, or pubescence. And they had an interesting relationship. And I thought that the fact that he already opposed this kind of institution while Twain was a child, I found that worth mentioning. But unfortunately, the thing is, I can provide you with many actual examples of how Twain got to interact with African Americans during his upbringing, but I can only provide you one example that he's even talked about as far as Native Americans, which is his mother's opinion. And opinions are very different than actual interactions with people. When you're actually able to form a relationship with a person, a space gets filled in your mind of who they actually are. You get to see the real them. But all he got was an opinion of an entire race, which kind of left a good amount of empty space to be filled. Unfortunately, due to time and such, I can't tell you all the rest of my project about the comparisons between the two, which would be mainly his literature, the other people that influenced him in these views, but I'm basically going to focus on what most people don't know, which is the Native American and his literature, as well as his writings about them. But natives and his literature, these are 3 quotes from some known books and essays of his. The first one being from his essay, The Noble Red Man, which is basically, it's a satirical comparison between the Cooper views of the Native American, which I'm talking about the Last of the Mohicans, the view of the honorable Indian with the majestic headdress and the beautiful war painting. He's basically taking that view and he's trying to destroy it because it's a romanticized view. And he had a great anger and frustration when it came to people who believed in these kind of views. So He is little and scrawny, black and dirty, and judged by even the most charitable of our canons of human excellence, is thoroughly pitiful and contemptible. That's kind of the theme of the entire second half of his essay. As well, the next example is a quote from Indian Joe, from Tom Sawyer, who is the main antagonist. Your father had me jailed for a vagrant. Did you think I'd forget? Indian blood ain't in me for nothing. That actually perpetuates a very known stereotype at the time that Indians, they usually didn't forget, and they were very vengeful. And one thing about that book in its entirety, and well, not in its entirety, but about its antagonist in general, it's expressed by multiple characters that the sole reason he's evil is because of his Indian blood. Not because of how he is as a man or how he was raised, but because he has Indian blood in it. And that book is not it's not as much of a satire as far as the Native Americans go. It's not trying to express any other types of, it's not expressing many examples of why we shouldn't view them that way. So that's why I've come to believe that it's more of a opinion that he held at the time. But then again, I can't prove that, can I? But there's also the next example, which is an excerpt from Innocents Abroad and his opinion on, we're called digger Indians. They're degraded savages who roast their dead relatives, then mix the human grease and ashes of bones with tar and guam, it thick all over their heads and foreheads and ears, and go caterwauling about the hills and call it mourning. Which, if you don't know, Innocence is a satire of the regular travel novel at the time, which really kind of represents the old world and what is the lands abroad. It really represents it in a kind of, in a romanticized view once again. It's really just a view that he really disliked because he thought that it wasn't real. He thought that it was a misrepresentation and exaggeration. So during his pleasure cruise at the time, he decided to represent the places and the people he saw in the most realist way he could, in opposition to the romanticized views. So, in my opinion, if he's trying to represent the realist views that he can, then I would think that his opinions would also be very relatively based on reality, not the opposite. But then, before going on a bit more, I wanted to add one more example, which would be, is that the clicking? Which would be a book that went unpublished, which was Huck and Finn Among the Indians. And basically the book is about, they basically decide to have Tom has the great idea for them to all go on an adventure and to go into Native American territory. And that goes awry. It really does not become the most happiest travel of theirs. But basically, Tom and Huck have to end up saving Jim and another girl who have been kidnapped by a band of Indians. And from what he wrote about it, they end up seeing an entire family, well, almost the entire family except for the girl who's kidnapped, gruesomely murdered. And it also has implications that the girl has either been raped or killed by now. So, at this point, what's interesting about it is the fact that he's mainly influenced by Colonel Richard I. Dodge and his two books, The Plains of the Great West and Their Inhabitants and Our Wild Indians, which are a cumulative effort of 33 years of his experience with the Native Americans. And he actually writes a letter to his good friend and also an author, Will Howes, about it. And he says, even though this man has spent 33 years with him, he still has sympathy for the lot. And he was kind of perplexed by that in a great way. But that also, during the reading of the book, at least the parts that he wrote, there's a really good shift in his tone. Because we all know him for being a very humorous man in his writing, being very satirical, and just really driving his points home with this kind of trademark writing style. But it takes that tone that basically goes away as you read, and it turns into something that's a lot more bitter and a lot more just very bitter and very desperate, cold-hearted, and angry at points. There's even one quote that Huck says about Tom, as they're talking to each other. He asked Tom, you know, where did you learn all that stuff about the Indians that you said before? And Tom just looks at him, so he's sad and he's cold. He just looks away, and Huck thinks to himself, Tom thinks to himself that just kind of gave away that what he said was just kind of fiction that he had read in his books. And he came to conclude that Tom had learned that Indians in real life aren't like Indians in books, which is kind of ironic since Huck and Finn and Huck and Tom among the Indians is a book. But even here are a few quotes as well. These are the two quotes that I got from that book and that manuscript. This is Tom's talk about the noble Native American before they went on the trip, and this is what I had previously said about when Huck had asked Tom where he got those opinions. But after that manuscript, it kind of marks a different change in the tone that Mark Twain has for the rest of his writing. It becomes less humorous, less satirical, and more bitter, and more just hate-driven in certain cases. I mean, obviously he's trying to prove his points and about race relations and in his later life religion, and he really does drive it home, but he doesn't drive it home in the same way. Which brings me to Following the Equator. These are some quotes from it, if you care to read. But Following the Equator is a lot like Innocents Abroad. He goes on another excursion and gets to see the people that are currently living there at the time, gets to look at their cultures, gets to observe events. And during this, while reading it, you see a really different tone from his earlier writings, which in his earlier writings, from what I've read at least, the only time he kind of gives the Native Americans some leeway is in Roughing It, when he compares them to the railroad workers, which he had apparently an even more deep-seated hatred towards. Says, come on, basically says, come on, these people are already living in the mountains and stuff. Don't compare them to them. They go through enough. That was the only real amount of leeway that I saw in his earlier work. But in Following the Equator, it expresses a much different tone. He basically comes to the conclusion that all land that has ever been taken or fought for, it's never been solely someone's land and theirs alone. It's always been won through taking, through stealing. And he's kind of just, over the course of the book, he comes to a conclusion that humanity as a whole, we may have our differences, and we may have our differences in the types of little, what's the word I'm looking for? Superficial. We may have the superficial, like race and where we were born, but ultimately we're still the same. And he also really tries to bring it home that types of things such as white supremacy and just the white privilege, basically, as well as empathy as well as being empathetic. Like the last quote, where he says, "Do not turn the situation around." 15?
No, yeah.
15? Okay, then I'm going to go to my conclusion. Basically, Twain, he didn't have the personal dealings with Native Americans that he had during his childhood, that he had with African Americans, and his experiences with them were just merely kind of based on opinions and what he got to see at the time. He had no first-hand accounts, and that left a lot to be decided. And whether or not he actually did try to whether or not he actually did cultivate a different opinion that he didn't express in his early writing, or tried to, or just believed in the opinions that he was presented, that's, something that somebody might be able to ask them when they meet him. But it is undeniable that he attacked the romanticized Native American throughout his writing. And, sorry, but there could have been better ways of doing this instead of just going to the far opposite side. He could have tried to make an account from the middle ground instead of going to an extremist view. And also the fact that there is a confirmed, it may not be proven that he had a confirmed prejudice, but you can definitely argue that he did not represent them in the way that he represented the African American, if you're familiar with books like Huck Finn or Roughing It, or the Following the Equator, as well as the United States, the History of Lyncherdom, correct? But as well, this being said, although I can never I can be very sure that I established that he did represent them in a negative format in his writings, in the majority of his writings, but he also does grow to have a sympathetic tone towards them in the end. And I would think that his ultimate opinion about them is that, well, we are the same in construction, and we are the same in the inverse. Whether it would be our color, our religion, or our affiliation with the country, we're still man.